You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is Tea Break Archaeology, where we explore the ancient origins of everyday objects. Hello and welcome to episode 36 of Tea Break, not Tea Break Time Travel, that's what I wanted to say, but this is Tea Break Archaeology with me, Dr. Matilda Siebrecht. A quick note, you may have noticed that the name has changed. We're going to get into that a little bit later. For now, just a short thing to say, we are still going to be focusing on tea breaks, but more in the literal sense. This is hopefully something that you will be able to listen to in your little tea break, probably scattered throughout the day, because I realize taking a half-hour tea break is not for everyone. But hopefully it's something that you can listen to, and it's something that you can sort of dip in and out of as the day progresses while you're having your tea breaks. But rather than focusing on sort of traveling back in the past, we're going to be keeping it a bit broader, hence the new name, Tea Break Archaeology. So, as I said, my name is Matilda Siebrecht. I have with me today a very delicious peach and vanilla tea, green tea with peach and vanilla flavoring, which is really nice. It's one of those ones that you only have to put in for 30 seconds, which luckily I have done enough now that I can remember it, because usually I'm the sort of person who leaves their tea to steep for quite a long time, probably too long in some cases. But this one, really, if you don't take it out after 30 seconds, it's a bit too much. Anyway, it's very delicious and it's very tasty, and I have been enjoying it greatly. So, even though I can imagine that probably a lot of you listening are already familiar with the podcast from its previous iteration, which was Tea Break Time Travel, I thought I would take this episode to just reintroduce the podcast, reintroduce myself, and share a little bit about my kind of motivations for the podcast, what I want to do with this, and why you, the listener, should continue to listen to the podcast and to other podcasts on the Archaeology Podcast Network like this. So first of all, a little bit about me. Hello, my name is Matilda. You can also call me Tilly. You may have heard me on other podcasts throughout the Archaeology Podcast Network. I am also a co-host along with Ash on And My Trowel, which looks at the intersection between fantasy, fiction, and archaeology. And I am also a co-host on the very recently released podcast, Archaeo Book Club podcast, which is a whole other story. Another project that I founded a couple of years ago, and we now have a podcast for it with my two admins of the book club, Ash and Judith. So that one's very much focused on books, as you can imagine. And if you're interested in finding out more, then do go and check them out. But for now, a little bit about me, myself. So I am an archaeologist, as you have probably guessed. I am also a journalist. In terms of my research background, I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology at the University of Aberdeen, which is in Scotland, which is also where I am from originally, but I do not live there anymore. I live on the continent, the European continent. But yes, Aberdeen Uni was where I did my undergraduate degree. And the degree was it was a Master of Arts, because basically in Scotland you can either do a 3-year undergrad and get a Bachelor of Science in things like archaeology, or you can do 4 years and you get a Master of Arts instead. So it is an undergraduate degree, but it's called a master's. It's a bit confusing. But yeah, so I have a Master of Arts in the archaeology of northern cultures. The focus of the course was on, as the name suggests, cultures that come from the north. So for example, North America, Northern Europe, Northern Siberia, etc. I then went on to specialize a little bit further. So that was a kind of very general degree. Most undergraduate degrees are, but that was a very general degree. And then I had discovered throughout this degree a real love of objects and artifacts and things and stuff, which you're probably thinking, well, of course, you're an archaeologist. But actually, archaeology involves so many different facets and so many different specializations. And there's some people that don't really deal with objects at all, but are still archaeologists, but they sort of deal with them in a very kind of not shallow sense, but not directly, a bit more indirect. Whereas I wanted to focus on the objects. I really wanted to specialize in object analysis, in working out a bit more about archaeological materials, go a bit more scientific, basically. So I went on to do a Master's of Science, and this was a Master's. It was at Leiden University, which is in the Netherlands. And the great thing with Leiden University is they actually have their own faculty of archaeology. So quite often archaeology at university is not, it's a department, or it's sort of a sub-department even, of a larger faculty. Most of the time, this is something to do with humanities or social sciences. At Aberdeen Uni, it was actually together with the geosciences. So we were together with disciplines like geography and geology and those kinds of things, which was quite nice. That was sort of why I guess it was a bit more science focused, which I enjoyed. But yes, in Leiden, it's not even associated with the social sciences or the humanities faculty. It's its own faculty, which was really amazing. That was really cool to experience. It meant that you had a lot of different sort of departments within the faculty, a lot of different subspecializations, and it really meant that you could explore different things. But you did have to specialize. So I decided to go for material culture studies, which I'll get into a little bit more afterwards, what exactly that is and why I sort of got into it. But it basically looks at material culture, which is the material remains of past cultures, sort of literally. So stuff, basically, objects and things. And I also looked at microware analysis was my method that I used, which basically uses microscopy to look at teeny tiny traces that are on the surface of archaeological objects. And by looking at those traces, you can work out how an object was made and used in the past, which I'm probably going to have to do an episode or two about microware analysis just because I find it really interesting. But if you want to find out more, do go and check out my blog, Mugs Make Some Microware, which is on my website. I will put the link in the show notes so you can go and check that out. I have written a couple of different articles about microware analysis and also have some wonderful guest blog posts from some colleagues who share their experience with microware analysis on different materials as well. So make sure to go and check that out if you are interested in finding out more about microware analysis at this point. And I also specialized in prehistory of Northwest Europe. So my thesis was in bronze, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, amber beads from the northern Netherlands. So that was my work, doing that kind of thing. And then following my master's, I did what a lot of archaeological students do when they graduate from a postgraduate degree, which is panic, basically, because you soon realize there are very little job opportunities and very limited options for you after you graduate. And so I panicked slightly. I was trying to find different positions. I did really want to continue in academia because there's lots of different paths that you can take once you have completed an archaeology degree as well. You can either, there's lots of different paths, but the sort of two main ones I would say is you go into academia. So you continue doing research, you do things like teaching, you run workshops, you attend seminars, you attend conferences, all those kinds of things. Or you can go in something that, at least in the UK, is known as commercial archaeology. In the US, it's known as cultural resource management, CRM. And that basically is a bit more commercialized. So it's a bit more focused on the excavation and not so much on the research behind it. There is still research that's done on the material, but it's more about kind of the excavation itself and the field work rather than the sort of researching the actual material. So the thing was, I, at that point, had already participated in quite a few excavations. And those of you who have listened to my trowel often will be well aware that I am not a field mouse. I am definitely a lab rat. I much prefer, even though I enjoy excavations, it has never been something that called to me, unlike a lot of my archaeological colleagues. A lot of my archaeological colleagues, they would be happy forever, I think, if you would just put them in the field for the rest of their lives. But for me, I enjoyed it, but for limited periods of time. And also I have various issues with things like my knee and my back and all these kinds of things, which were just making it a little more uncomfortable. And I really loved the post-excavation work. So the stuff that happened once all of the objects have been pulled out of the ground, looking at them, analyzing them, sorting them, cataloging them, cleaning them, all of that aspect I love. I really love that part. So I soon decided, okay, I don't want to really go into commercial archaeology because that'll probably be mainly excavation. Fun fact, I am now working for a commercial archaeological company, but I am only doing the post-excavation analyses for that very reason. But so I didn't at that point want to go that direction. I really wanted to teach and I really wanted to do further research. So I was looking for PhD positions, but having very little luck. And then I did a lot of other things in between. I had a business selling prehistory inspired jewelry. I taught English for a long time. I helped run an English school in the Netherlands. I did all sorts of things. And this was the point where I started to volunteer doing other stuff. And I got into the field of journalism. So I started to volunteer for how did I get into it? I started to volunteer for a radio program in the Netherlands, an English-speaking radio program in the Netherlands. Discovered I loved it. Remember that I also loved writing. I've always been really into writing. And decided, okay, let's accept that I might not be able to have a future in archaeology. What else do I want to do? This is, by the way, something, if you're listening and you're quite early on in your career in archaeology, I would really strongly recommend already thinking of a plan B that you would be really happy with. So for me, it was journalism, because I figured I could still somehow do that with archaeology. I could still somehow, do science journalism, history journalism, heritage journalism. I could focus what I wanted to do. And I really recommend if you're starting out in archaeology, even if you're really optimistic and think that everything's going to go swimmingly, it might, but always good to have a plan B so that you don't have that wave of disappointment if it ever does inevitably happen. Inevitably, not inevitably, if it ever does happen. So yes, for me, it was journalism. And I thought, okay, let's pursue that then. So I did a postgraduate diploma at the London School of Journalism. Luckily, I was able to do it online. I was going to go there and do it in person, but luckily I was able to do it online because then I got a PhD position, as luck would have it, right? As is the way of things, at the University of Groningen, which is in the northern Netherlands. And the PhD was looking at Arctic material culture. So that was quite nice because it sort of combined everything that I'd done so far, right? It looked at the northern cultures sort of element that I'd had in my undergraduate degree. It looked at the material culture and the sort of archaeological science from my master's. And then I was able to sort of put that all together and apply it to a really fascinating case study, which was a Paleo-Inuit material culture from Arctic Canada, which was really fascinating. And I've definitely talked about that a lot on my social media and in my blogs and all sorts of things. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, do go and check out probably my social media profile is the best. So the Archaeologist Teacup on Instagram, for example. And I'll probably do one about Paleo-Inuit material culture at some point. My thesis is also freely available to read. So anyway, if anyone's interested in finding out more about that, feel free. But yeah, so then that's how I sort of got to where I am today in terms of that research background. So I was able to, throughout my PhD, also use the skills that I was learning throughout my journalism degree. I became involved in podcasting. I became involved in all that element of science communication. So I really strongly believe that, it's so important for archaeologists or any academics to make sure that their research is widely accessible and kind of approachable and understandable by the general public, because a lot of the time the research that we're doing is funded in some indirect way by big companies, but also a lot of the time by things like government funding and that kind of thing. And it's important to be able to demonstrate why we should have that funding and why it's important, and also important to demonstrate to ourselves why it's important. We should be contributing to modern, like present and future society, as well as investigating past society. It's that classic thing, right? Like you're looking at the past to be able to understand the present and build towards a better future. It's, but it's true. And that's what we have to do. So I really strongly believe in the importance of good science communication. And so I was able to practice that throughout the PhD and get quite a lot of experience in different aspects of things, one of which included podcasting. And this is when I started my podcast, Tea Break Time Travel, because I wanted to share my love of materials and objects. So let's get a little bit more into that. So material culture studies. So as I mentioned, material culture studies is kind of the study of material evidence from past cultures. That's putting it very simply. That's a real oversimplification of it. But basically, it's looking at objects, looking at things, which I got into because I don't know, I've always been fascinated by objects and stuff anyway. I was always definitely the kind of kid who, collected cool rocks and sticks and things. I mean, I feel like most kids are like that. And I just really loved sort of little old statues, little ancient things and cool looking stuff. And I don't know, I just always had a collection of things. So I've always liked stuff and objects, which is, as I look around my desk now, probably not a good thing. But point being, what I really love about objects is when you can find out a story about them, that they're not just an object. They're not just a standalone object. And there's all kinds of kind of theories around this that I think would be interesting actually to go into at some point. There's something called post-processualism, which was a whole like theoretical thing within archaeology, a whole kind of different viewpoint and sort of revolution in some ways within archaeological theory. And one of the points of post-processualism is this idea that objects are not passive. Like an object is not, is not agentless. So basically, objects have as much of an influence on us as we do on them in some form. It's called object agency. So it sort of means that they form our lives just as much as we create these objects, which, and there's all sorts of really cool studies about it. I'll go into that, I think, in a different one because we don't really have as much time this time to go into that. And so, so that's how I sort of got interested in that, because I wanted to find out the stories. And then one of the big things about archaeology is storytelling, right? It's about finding out what happened. It's about kind of working out what happened to these objects and why they were important and how people in the past interacted with them. So it's sort of almost like a detective story, especially microware analysis, because you're really looking into detail about like how these objects were made and used. So you're really looking at, tiny little footprints and fingerprints, basically. Actually, fun story. Speaking of fingerprints, one of my favorite ever microware traces is this thing called handling traces, which is basically where on bone, you can actually see traces from where human fingers have touched it, because there's some kind of chemical reaction that happens, and they leave these like little pock marks, which are different to the natural pock marks on bone. They're like specially human created, something to do with the chemicals in our skin or something. Living human skin in contact with bone will leave traces. So you can look at an object through the microscope and you can see where someone was holding it in the past. Amazing. Anyway, so that's why I got into it. And I think that it's really important because especially the region that I focus on, which is prehistory, which is anything before the written records. We don't have historic accounts, so we don't have things written down where people are telling us, yes, this is a blah-de-blah, and we use it for this. We only have the objects. And so then you have to work out, it's like a big lovely puzzle, and you have to try and work out what these objects are and why they were used and what they were used for and why and that kind of thing. So that was why I wanted to kind of share my enthusiasm for that, I guess, through the podcast. So that's why I started Tea Break Time Travel, partly because I just wanted to indeed engage with science communication, practice that, also just contribute to it, contribute to a body of work that I think is really important of professional archaeologists who are sharing their research in an accessible way. And that's why I did Tea Break Time Travel. And it was amazing. And I did so much with it and I was so happy with it. And I had some incredible guests on. I learned so much about so many different objects. And but then I had to take a little bit of a break. And speaking of breaks, we're going to have a little one now, but we'll be back in a second. So why the break? Why the end of Tea Break Time Travel and the rise of Tea Break Archaeology? I hear you cry because you're all so fascinated in that, right? So basically at some point when I finished the PhD, first of all, I had some kids during the PhD, which was fine, but it just, it gives more work on top of things. And then once I finished the PhD, the nice thing with the PhD is basically assuming you can get funding for it or you get a paid position for it, you're basically being paid to just research a topic that you are fascinated by for potentially 4 years. And that's all you have to do. It's amazing. And obviously in some cases you have to do different things. Some people have to teach. Some people have other tasks that they have to do alongside their PhD research. I was very lucky in that I didn't actually have to teach. Well, I wasn't technically allowed to teach, but that's a whole other story because of the type of PhD contract I was on. But it meant that's why I was able to dedicate so much time to kind of improving my science communication alongside my PhD, because to me, it was as important in my kind of training and in the formation of who I wanted to eventually become as an academic as the research itself was how I communicated it. And so the podcasting was part of that. But after the PhD, I was very lucky in that I was offered a couple of different jobs at various places that I had been volunteering for quite a while and places where I had worked before, and they sort of were happy for me to come back. So, for example, the Commercial Archaeological Unit, which I'm currently working for here in Germany. And then also I was very lucky to get a job on the Archaeology Podcast Network. So you've probably seen my face on the social media accounts of the APN because I am their social media manager, helping with that, that idea of outreach and communication. And then I also was volunteering for a long time for the EXARC, which is the International Society for Experimental Archaeology and Open Air Museums, amongst other things. And I have been volunteering for them actually as a host for their podcast. And I would help out. I was the sort of lead moderator of different conferences and other meetings and everything, and helped out a lot with sort of moderation and hosting of various things. Again, thanks to my journalism background, that's why I was asked to do that. And they actually offered me the position of director of EXARC. So it's an international academic society. We have members from all over the world. And yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot of work to do. It was a lot of new things to take on. And I'm really glad that I did take them on in some ways because it's a lot of variation, which is nice, a lot of diversity. But of course, as you can imagine, it led to its issues because rather than just being able to focus on one big project, which I had been doing for the last 4 years, I now had 3 different jobs, plus all of my extracurricular projects that I wanted to be doing and all of this kind of thing. And at some point, I just had to prioritize and say, okay, well, this podcast, the Tea Break podcast, is the one, it's only me doing it. I don't have co-hosts who would want to keep it going. I love doing it, but I need to cut down some things. This will be something I have to cut down. But I decided I don't want to get rid of it forever. I want to keep going with it eventually. I just need a bit of a break to just reset and be able to work things out. So I did. So that's why it's been a little bit of a break. And I was happy with the way that the podcast was going and how it was focused and how it was angled. But I wanted to kind of reassess what I actually wanted to do with the podcast, because now it wasn't going to be alongside my research necessarily. It wasn't going to be kind of helping with that aspect, because I had decided I probably didn't want to continue in academia for various reasons. But I still wanted to continue with the sort of science communication and with archaeological work. And so, yeah, I was basically trying to think how to redo the podcast in a way that would make me happy, would be beneficial, would be interesting, but also would sort of be more of an accurate reflection of me and my interests and my work. And it was a joke that we made at some point in one of our work meetings with the Archaeology Podcast Network. Someone mentioned the phrase cozy archaeology. I think it's because we were talking about different reading styles and things. And I am a big fan of things like cozy fantasy, cozy mystery, basically anything cozy I'm down for, because I enjoy being able to just sort of escape, but it's going to be fine. And, it's all good. I do enjoy, by the way, the occasional more dramatic or intense thing, but just in general, if I need an escape, I'm going to go for something cozier. Probably also why I'm a fan of tea. But anyway, and I wanted to build on that idea indeed. And I thought, actually, that fits really well with the sort of the aim of my platforms, the Archaeologist Teacup. I want to try and make it a safe space and a cozy, in quotes, space that people feel comfortable in, that people feel like they can learn things that aren't necessarily of world or political or major importance directly. They obviously, everything has some impact, and archaeology is very political. But I wanted to create some kind of space and topics and platforms where it was more focused on kind of fun little everyday things and kind of keeping it a bit smaller scale, I guess. And I thought, okay, well, let's focus more on then this whole thing of the Archaeologist Teacup. I mean, my whole reasoning behind calling it the Archaeologist Teacup and focusing on tea was for several reasons. First of all, tea is pretty much international. There's very few countries in the world which won't have something equivalent to tea. Every country has some sort of hot beverage that allows them to just relax and chill and is supposed to be calming, has health benefits, has all of these sorts of things and has some sort of history. So tea is something that everyone can relate to in some way. There's probably very few people where if you say, oh, do you want a cup of tea? They won't reply with some sort of, oh, well, of course. I know that some people don't like tea, but then they might drink coffee or hot chocolate or something else, there's always something. And tea just seemed to be the most kind of universal, I suppose. And I just really love tea. I wasn't as a fan of coffee back then, so that's why tea. So there was that. There was also that tea sort of implies indeed that kind of sitting down, having a cup of tea, just being calm, having a break, being able to sort of just chat without any kind of extra agenda or without any kind of pressure on having to chat about something. It's just, having a chat over a cup of tea. It's got that implication, right? It's got that very chill vibe to it. So tea is international, tea is approachable, but also tea is varied. there isn't one kind of tea. There's so many different kinds of teas. It's so variable no matter where you are in the world. And also, you know, related to what I was saying before about the different sort of hot beverages. If you are someone who drinks a hot beverage, that will, you know, it's very unlikely that more than one person will have exactly the same kind of preference, you know? There's bound to be some preferential differences. And that, I think, perfectly represents as well the variety that exists in the world and the sort of acceptance that we should have of that variation. Anyway, very long, convoluted way of saying I like tea. I wanted to make a podcast about tea. But it's not actually about tea, of course, but it is about that everything that tea represents, I guess, to me. So yes. But so in this sort of new direction then of the podcast, rather than focusing on the objects themselves and focusing on this idea of traveling back in time and sort of getting a snapshot of past life, I thought, well, no, okay, let's focus more indeed on what if you were just to sit down, have a chat with someone over a cup of tea and want to talk about archaeological objects. What would you talk about? Sure, you would also talk about the occasional, cool object, like, oh, did you know this object and blah, 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 blah. And there's all this cool history behind it. And this is someone who researched it. And these are some amazing findings that we've had from it recently. And these are what the wider implications of it are and everything. Of course, you'll have that. But you might also have like, I wonder when the first notebook was. Or, oh, I wonder where pens come from. Or, why has the calendar changed so much? And these things might not seem kind of important. We have them everywhere. Sort of, I guess, everyday archaeology. So it's all these things that just a part of our everyday lives are just so fixed in modern society in some way or form. And we now just sort of take them for granted, but we don't actually sort of think about them too much. But actually, they would have had really far-reaching consequences for the development of society. All of these things that are now part of our everyday life have some story, have some agency, shall we say, or have something that they have done and they have contributed to the way that we have built up society over the last, thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into that. So not just looking at particular objects or object types, but looking at kind of everyday objects and, how we look at them and how they've developed over time. And this was sort of highlighted as well because I found on Tea Break Time Travel before, I used to always ask people, if you could go back in time, where would you go? And pretty much all of my guests always said something along the lines of, oh, I would want to go and visit a maker of shoes because I'd really love to find out what kind of needles they were using or, something like this. It was always focusing on the everyday. It was always trying to see how people just lived their lives. And so I wanted to kind of focus more on that idea of the everyday and normal things, in quotes. So with that in mind, that's what I wanted to do today, is introduce this new angle, this new show, which will be called Tea Break Archaeology. Not a massive difference, I know, but hopefully enough of a difference that it kind of differentiates it. So the show will be bi-monthly. Each episode will be about 30 minutes long, give or take. And we're going to focus on objects or object types from the sort of everyday, but also kind of crafts and crafting and how crafts have developed and traditions and technologies have developed, because that's also something that's really fascinating. Quite a lot of the time, you look at an object from the past and you don't really always think about who made it and where that tradition comes from. How did they learn these skills? How did that all happen? I say as archaeologists, if you're listening in, of course you do. But I think a lot of people don't realize that. So I wanted to kind of highlight this. Sometimes it'll be just me chatting away about things. Sometimes I'll have a guest with me, especially if I'm looking at a particular archaeological object. I always try to make sure I have someone who actually knows a lot what they're talking about, who has some background in it, who has some sort of expertise. And I also want to try and have a lot of crafts people on who will be able to give us a bit of an insight into kind of how different traditions, technological traditions have developed and how crafts are practiced today as well in comparison to the past. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes. I've already got the first couple of episodes recorded and I'm so excited for you to hear them. So the first couple are going to be about the archaeology of notebooks. So we have one from me just about general archaeology, but then we'll also be chatting to a professional bookbinder and we'll be chatting to someone who is researching a very interesting historic notebook. I won't give away too much. You'll just have to listen in and see which notebook I'm referring to. But I would really love if you as a listener got involved. It's always wonderful to have interactions with people who are listening. I love to hear feedback from people, but also, be inspired, get ideas. If you have ideas for the kinds of objects you want to learn about, or if you have ideas for something that you don't think has been talked about enough or anything like that, get in touch. Let me know, and I would love to hear your thoughts. You're welcome to follow me on any kind of social media platform under the name The Archaeologist Teacup. I also have a website where you can find the blog and all kinds of other links and things. If you're also interested in sort of hearing more from other podcasts with a focus on archaeology or heritage in some form, definitely go and check out the APN, Archaeology Podcast Network Discord server. You'll be able to find the link through the website. I will also put it in the show notes here. I'm also on there, and I occasionally have a live recording for Tea Break Archaeology for bonus content for members, but the live recording is free and available to everyone. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. They have different live events every month from all of the different shows, and you'll be able to chat with like-minded people and hear about that there. So thank you very much for listening to this new introduction. And I look forward to having you join me on this journey and seeing where the podcast progresses. I'm going to go and top up my cup of tea. In the meantime, goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this tea break. If you like this episode, please do like, follow, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to check out the other shows on the APN for more fun archaeology content. And if you'd like to learn more about the topic of today's episode, make sure to check the show notes for links and further information.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Culturo Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with AutoQuote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.